Welcome to part 3 of your podcast. Yesterday, or in the last part, you heard the basics of the Indian Act and things that were added throughout the years. It ended right before they talked to Theresa Vandermeer Chase, who has been affected by the Indian Act and in particular by the fact that Indigenous women were discriminated against in the Indian Act further because they're women. So they're going to explain how she was discriminated against and how her family was discriminated against. And then you're going to hear a summary of the Indian Act and of the podcast. So you are going to have one more Microsoft form. And in this form, there are 4 questions. 3 of those questions have directly to do with the Indian Act and your thoughts about the Indian Act and how you might relate to it, even if you're not Indigenous. The 4th question, and it's not a typo, asks you to step away from the computer. And I can't remember how long I said. It says either at least 20 or 30 minutes. And what I want you to do in this time is do something that you love to do. Okay, so you need to think about something that you love to do that isn't electronics. Okay, it has to be something that's not electronics. So you can go outside, you can play hockey, you can ride your bike, you can go for a walk, you can read a book, you can watch a movie. Well, you can't watch a movie because that's electronics. Now, if you are reading a book and your book is, say, on a Kobo, then that's okay because even though it's on technology, it's the book part that you're paying attention to. So that part would be okay. So I want you to step away from all technology for 20 to 30 minutes, and then you're going to come back and you're going to answer the question that is written for you on the Microsoft form. So make sure that what you do that you love is not electronic. Okay? So when you step away, it will be not electronic. So we're going to listen now to the last part of our podcast. Again, has to do with Theresa Vandermeer Chase and how the Indian Act has affected her family directly. And then we'll have a wrap-up of the podcast. Take a listen.
Dine ke dochet nona shonti, nogle ke Theresa Vandermeer Chase shonti. My Apatanana name is Dochet Nona. It means strong woman on a hill watching over her people. And my English name is Theresa Vandermeer Chase. I am a member of the White River First Nation of Beaver Creek, Yukon, and Alaska because my family is separated by the border. And I am a full-time artist and contract curator.
Just to be clear, I did know her name was Chase. I just forgot. So, Theresa Vandermeer Chase.
I'm wondering if you could tell me just a little bit about how your family came to be without status.
Sure. So my grandma married my grandpa. My grandma is a Patanana woman, and she met my grandpa, who was a young Frisian man, from Northern Holland. He came over right at the end of the Second World War, and he made his way to the Yukon in his 20s, and then, I don't know, they fell in love, got married, and they had some kids, and at that time, my grandma, because she married my non-Indigenous grandpa, lost her Indian status. So she was no longer recognized by the Canadian government, the federal government, as status Indian. She was just kind of seen as an everyday citizen. With the history of the gender discrimination in the Indian Act, the main part of it is, let's say, an Indigenous man marries a non-Indigenous woman. She gained status. Her kids gained status. And if her kids married and had children with another non-Indigenous person, their children would also gain status. So where the gender discrimination comes into play is when my grandma married my grandpa, who's non-Indigenous, she lost status. Her kids never had status until 1985, and I, a product of my mom, who's mixed race, having a child with my dad, who's non-Indigenous, I never had status. So that's where the gender discrimination comes into play. It's all about the original women that married non-Indigenous men. The discrimination kind of went down all the way to their grandchildren.
And can you tell me a little bit about, I guess, your decision to gain status?
Oh, God. That's a big one for me. With my grandma, being raised in a small Indigenous community in northern Canada that's linked very close to Alaska, and when you're raised around your Indigenous family more so than your non-Indigenous family, your identity is quite firm. I have light skin, I have blue eyes, but I was taught to be a First Nation person. I was an Indigenous woman. I was a Dene, Upper Tanana person. It didn't matter if I was status or non-status. I was considered a non-status Indian at that time. It didn't matter because my grandma had always said, you're an Indian person. She'd say to me when I was a kid, Teresa, are you an Indian? And I'd be like, yeah, I am, And then she'd be like, the next year, the next couple years, she'd be like, Teresa, are you First Nation? Yes, I am. Teresa, are you, White River First Nation? Yes, yeah, I am. She always kept pushing that identity to make sure that I was confident in my identity because I'm the only grandchild that has such fair skin. My cousins and I grew up very, very close. We're considered brother cousins. So growing up with them, they all kind of ended up with darker skin than me. So I think my grandma felt a need to kind of reassure my identity. So when the option of becoming a status Indian came up, I thought at first it was kind of like a no-brainer because it's like, well, I already am. I don't really need a card, but I might as well have a card, yeah.
Yeah, proof, hard
Yeah,
proof.
exactly. Hard proof.
Hard,
I'm like,
hard
yes.
laminated proof-ish. Yeah.
But, it was after I actually applied for the card that I started to question whether or not I really needed that quote-unquote proof. Because it's like, okay, so what happens now? Like yesterday I was non-status and now I'm a status Indian. What happens now? Like, what's next? What does this give me? What has it taken away? And I think in a lot of respects, it's taken away a little bit of freedom because now I'm once again in another category. You have your Canadian passport, that's a category. You have your driver's license, and that's a category. And now you have Indian status, and you're in a category. Like with my grandma's words always in my head, like, you're an Indian, Teresa, are you an Indian? Asking that question, and I'm saying yes, because she taught me to say yes. I thought that was good enough. But society doesn't really like that. And they prefer you either have proof or you're not one. So I think that's where it kind of came into play that I wanted the card.
Okay, so why can't we just push the Indian Act into the ocean?
Well, it has become so deeply entrenched into the Canadian legal system, it's hard to undo the knot. In 1969, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his Minister of Indian Affairs, future Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, presented the White Paper on Indian Policy.
It's a very on-the-nose title.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, totally.
Really? This paper proposed an end to the Indian Act and the legal relationship between Canada and First Nations people. It would eliminate Indian status, dissolve the Department of Indian Affairs, abolish the Indian Act, and it would appoint a commissioner to look at land claims and terminate treaties.
So wait, based on everything we've just heard and everything you've just told me, why would that be such a terrible idea? We've just talked about the act being really terrible for Indigenous people.
Well, it would terminate our identities and our rights as sovereign nations. Our reserve lands would be for sale, our treaties would be dissolved. To many Indigenous people, those treaties, those agreements, our ancestors made those, and they are sacred to us. It would also erase Canada's history and responsibilities. It would mean we become assimilated.
Right.
We would just become Canadians.
And so we still have the Indian Act. So do you have a copy?
I do. It was my great-grandmother's. She passed away when she was 101.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah. She lived alone until she was 100, and she passed away when she was 101. We were cleaning out our house, me and my sister one day, we were going through some things, some of her papers, and there's a stack of magazines, and just out of this stack of magazines, they sort of fell over, and a copy of the Indian Act popped out.
Oh, amazing.
And inside it were actually the election papers, the first election papers for Six Nations Band Council. I don't know why she kept it. I don't know what it meant to her. You know, I thought about it a lot. I thought about that day when we found it a lot, writing this episode, and I thought she must have known that it meant something, and that it, you know, somehow.
Well, it would have so much meaning in her life, whether good or bad, right?
Yeah. I wonder what she understood about it, this paper, this document, written by white men, far away from our reserve. And in the end, I guess it doesn't really matter, because what say do we have in any of this anyway? The thing for me that's really upsetting about all of this is that when we think about the Royal Proclamation, those agreements were there. It was nation to nation. We were coming together and we were making agreements about how we were going to move forward. But the thing is, as we moved forward, as Canada moved forward, it forgot about that agreement. It pushed that agreement to the side, and it just did whatever it wanted to do.
Well, yeah, it didn't stick to its side of the agreement. So really that agreement is null and void. You know, like that is the truth of it. That's the truth of it.
And I mean, the thing is, I don't want to let it go. Like, I don't want the Royal Proclamation to be let go. I want to hold on to the Royal Proclamation because I feel like we didn't come together to create the Indian Act.
So you feel, in a way, that the Royal Proclamation was the last time, really, that nation-to-nation agreement happened. And then from then on, Canada didn't hold up its end of that agreement and then just started making new laws and not really consulting and doing whatever it wanted.
Yeah, and I mean, even in treaties that were, you know, post the Royal Proclamation, they haven't been honored. They haven't been treated as sacred, which they are to us. They are to us. Those are our ancestors' signatures on those pieces of paper. That is a sacred thing that we have to hold on to. When it's disregarded like that, when you try to lay pieces of policy over top of pieces of policy over top of pieces of policy so that we can't remember what the initial thing is that we agreed to, you're not going to make us forget. We remember.
And that's the end of the information for the podcast. The rest of what's on is just about the podcast itself and the people who are narrating it. So your task now is to go to Microsoft Forms and answer the questions. And remember that you have somewhere around 20 or 30 minutes where you have to spend your time electronic free doing something that you love. So think about something that you really love to do. I know that some of you love to play hockey. It could be that you love to read. It could be that you love to take a nap. That one, maybe not so much, because it's not, I mean, it's recharging, but it's not really using your brain. So do something that will either use your brain, like reading, or something physical, like hockey. Maybe it's basketball. Maybe you have a net in the driveway and you like to shoot hoops. Whatever it is. Maybe you like to draw. I know that some of you are good at drawing. Okay? So whatever you like to do that is not electronic. Go and do it, because then you can come back and you can answer that last question that's on the Microsoft form. There are 3 other ones to answer, don't forget. This one has to do with the last question. Get away from the electronics, do something you love, come back and answer that last question. Okay, so this ends the lesson for Activity 1. Activity 2 will be up hopefully on Friday. Have fun doing what you love without using the electronics.